Good morning. I am Jason Jarvis. I'm a pastor at Calvary Grace Church, and we've been studying through the book of 1 Peter. And I want to talk to you this morning about how to stand firm in God's favor. How to stand firm in God's favor. I'm going to give you about 4 ways to stand firm in God's favor. We might just deal with one in this video, but we'll have connecting videos that go on and explain how we can stand firm in God's favor. If you would like, you can turn in your Bibles to 1 Peter, the book of 1 Peter. And the last chapter in 1 Peter, Peter says this: "By Silvanus, a faithful brother, as I regard him, I have written briefly to you, exhorting and declaring that this is the true grace of God. Stand firm in it." And so Peter is a man who knows what it's like to not stand firm in grace. As he walked with Jesus for 3.5 years and learned much from him, he learned also about himself. He learned that he at times is not faithful, and that he even is a bit proud, saying, you know what, if everybody else leaves you, I'm not leaving you. I'm going to be loyal to you. And then hours later, he ends up denying him not one time, but denies him 3 times. And in that third denial on that night, Jesus foretold that the rooster would crow. And it did, just as Peter denied him a 3rd time. But he was in eye range of Jesus, and just as he denied Jesus, the cock crowed, and Jesus looked at him. Jesus cares about us, even in our worst situations, even when we seem to be failing miserably. Jesus cares. So how do we stand firm in this grace? Well, the first thing we need to do is to remain humble. We need to remain humble. Humility means to get low. It means to bring yourself down a notch. It means to see your inadequacies for what they are. It means to not consider, it means to kind of like pruning your pride. That you need to cut out some of your pride. I know you can't cut it out all of it, but you can prune some of it. And what Peter is telling us in chapter 5, verse 6 is, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him, because he cares for you." So earlier on in chapter 5, he tells us to clothe ourselves with humility toward one another. And that has the idea of tying on an apron of humility towards one another. In other words, we are to serve one another out of this humility that says, you know what, I'm not better than you, I'm here for you, I'm your servant. And the reason we do that is because God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. So I'd rather have grace than be opposed by God. And so he's telling us here that God opposes the proud. That means to knock them out of order, or to press them down, or to knock them down. And that's what happens when we get proud. We get knocked down, and it could be God actually being the one that's knocking us down. So he tells us in 6 to humble yourselves. Well, if you don't humble yourself, God will humble you. So I would say best advice Peter's giving here is we should humble ourselves. That way when God humbles us, we're already, in some sense, used to it and recognizing that this is where I should be. I shouldn't be proud. I should be humble. He says, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God. The mighty hand of God is the picture of God's power. We need to see our circumstances and our lives and what goes on around us as subject to God's power. Just as Jesus saw his life as subject to the power of God. You saw the hand of God in Jesus' life. And let me tell you, nobody was ever more humble than Jesus. His humility showed us very clearly God's power through him. Jesus humbled himself by becoming a man. And even in human form, we saw God's power through Jesus. So Peter here is telling us if we humble ourselves under God's power, under God's hand, that God will, in the right time, exalt us. Not because we humbled ourselves, but because in God's timing, that's what he will do. He will exalt us at the right time. But understand this mighty hand of God, this power, is recognizing that God is sovereign. It is his hand that is in control of my life and your life. He's working out his purposes. And if you don't like some of these purposes, and I don't like some of these purposes, it's because I'm proud. It's because I don't see it the way God sees it. But what I must do is humble myself, knowing that God has a plan through this. Just as Jesus understood. He would experience all kinds of persecutions and the religious leaders trying to trap him, and them trying to even, arrange that he would be accused and put to death. Jesus was humble in all that. He was recognizing that their power didn't come from themselves. It was given of God. God gave Pilate the authority. God gave Annas authority. God gave these high priests authority and the religious peoples their authority. And Jesus knew that. And Jesus humbled himself under the mighty hand of God. And what happened? Well, he was killed. Surely that can't be. That's not what God wants. He doesn't want us to be humbled so that we're killed. But what happened after he was killed? 3 days later, God highly exalted him. No one was ever more humble than Jesus. So if you want to grow in humility, the way to grow in humility is to look at the great one, Jesus Christ. To exalt him in your mind, to see him as the epitome of humility. I was listening to some cultural philosophers and life coaches online, and they were saying things like what you should do in order to be humble is that you should find somebody who's humble and imitate them. Well, in other words, you should exalt some other person who probably doesn't think themselves humble, and you should follow them. Well, who defines what humility is? I mean, there's always somebody more humble than someone else. And if you think you're humble and the people around you show you that they're more humble than you, are you still humble? So the important thing to realize is we must define humility the way God defines it. And God gives you the picture of humility of Jesus Christ in Philippians 2. He humbled himself to the point of death, even death on a cross. He was obedient. He submitted to God. He took on human form. Human form in and of itself is a humble form in comparison to God. And see, that's it. That's where you really find humility. You find humility as you look at God, and where you see God most clearly, where you see his hand most powerfully, is in the person of Jesus Christ. Jesus is an example to us of humility, who, if we keep our mindset on him, we will be humble. We will not be humble when we think we are humble. The moment you believe you're humble, you're not humble. But if you keep your mindset on Christ and you have the attitude that he had about people and about God, then you'll be humble, but you won't even know it, which is true humility. It's a supernatural work of God to make you humble like Christ. How does Peter tell us to remain humble? He says these words in verse 7. Casting all your anxieties on him. Anxiety is a form of worry. Anxiety is a constant state of being concerned about things that you may or may not have control of. And what Peter is saying is the way to be humble is to cast your worries, your anxieties on Jesus. You're to roll them on him. You're to throw them off of you and onto him. You're to leave them at God's feet. You're to bring them to God and you're to leave them there. Did Jesus do this? Yes, he did. In the garden, Jesus cast his cares on God. He says, I wish I didn't have to go through this. Let this cup pass from before me, but not my will, your will be done. He was casting his cares on God. And trust me, that was the single greatest worry in his whole human life, was that God was about to pour out his wrath on him. So Jesus, again, is an example of casting our cares on God. We're to do that. What are your greatest cares? This is a picture of salvation. Your anxieties stem from your limitations, from your faults, from your mistakes, from your failures. That's where a lot of your anxieties are. And when we can cast them on God, when we can cast them off of us and onto him, we're saying, my sin, I can't deal with it. My guilt, I can't deal with it. My trespasses, I can't deal with it. My problems, I can't deal with them. My disease, my cancer, my weakness, my children, my wife, my marriage, my job, I can't deal with these things. I need to be saved. I need someone else's power. I need God's power at work in my life. And that's what you get when you humble yourselves and put yourselves under the mighty hand of God in such a way as you recognize that these circumstances are divinely arranged by him, and he's arranging them in order that you would cast your cares on him. And the reason he calls you to cast your cares on him is because he cares for you. He cares for you. Humble yourself and realize, it's a humbling thing to realize the God of the universe cares for you. That should humble you. In and of itself, that should humble you. And look at the trouble. Look at the anxiety. Look at what Jesus went through to show you he cares for you. He was willingly separated from his Father to demonstrate his care for you, so that he would take the anxieties, he would take the pain, he would take the judgment, he would take your failures. You cast your cares on him because he cares for you. That's why you do it. That's how you remain humble. The proud person experiences anxiety because so much of what they're trying to do, they can't. Or they're overburdened. Or they're heavy laden. They're being wore out by their pride to show everybody else that they can do it. To show themselves that they can do it. It's simple self-reliance. In fact, if you listen to most of these cultural experts, they'll tell you this is what you need to do. You just need to suck it up and go forward and use your will to overcome your feelings. Use your will to overcome your wrong thoughts. And essentially, it just builds and builds, because even when you, let's say you do overcome those problems and overcome those thoughts, then it's still incumbent upon you to continue to bear up under all the pressure that you put on yourself and that other people put on you. Life is hard. But it's really hard when you're proud. And so what Jesus calls you to do is to come to him if you're weary, if you're burdened, if you're heavy laden, and learn from him. And what you can learn from him is that he cares for you, and that you should cast, throw, get rid of, leave your anxieties with him. And that is a daily, moment-by-moment thing. You have to constantly remember, I left that worry with Christ. I left that worry with God. He can handle this. I can't. He can handle it. And then you fight the temptation as you're trusting someone else to solve your problem. You fight the temptation to think, well, am I being lazy? Am I being irresponsible just trusting God for this? You are designed to trust God for this. Every problem you have, every challenge you meet, are not opportunities for you to solve, but opportunities for you to trust God. So how do you stand firm in God's favor? You recognize His favor is that He cares for you. His favor is that He says, come, unload on me. Give me your burdens. I'll carry them. That's how you stand firm in grace. You stand firm knowing that God doesn't change. He's going to be good to you. He's going to carry your burdens. You just have to leave them with Him. You have to cast them from you to Him. And you have to trust that He cares for you. This is how you humble yourself under the mighty hand of God. This is how you stand firm in God's favor. Number 1, we just said, remain humble. Number 2, we'll look at next time, remain sober. Number 3, remain alert. And number 4, resist the devil.